Hi, I'm John. I'm going to talk about my takeaways from some of the things we've discussed in class so far. So, beginning with the first class, we talked about some of the most important interactions in life, and we were introduced to Fromm's idea that there are two ways of approaching these relationships: the having mode and the being mode. These relationships are all applicable to our lives in some form or another, and the ones that Fromm specifically talks about are learning, remembering, conversing, reading, knowing, faith, and loving. In the having mode, all of these interactions involve possessing something, whether it's knowledge or qualifications or another person. But in the being mode, they're more about awareness of the text or the other person. The having mode is adequate for a lot of the tasks we do on a daily basis, but there's more to be learned from experiencing the being mode. In my opinion, the having mode serves primarily the lower portion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in the West, it seems like the having mode is the only way, or at least the easiest, because so much of our lives are structured for it. For instance, the idea of marriage as simply mutual ownership, or of education as simply amassing knowledge. Um, the being mode is active and must be maintained, whereas the having mode is passive. And this is the difference between learning or loving versus having knowledge or having love and assuming that you can keep them without action. And this has changed the way I think about certain tasks, or at least made me more conscious of how I think. So, one of the areas where this applies most to me is Quiz Bowl. So, in Quiz Bowl, there's just an immense amount of information out there to be learned or remembered, and there are multiple ways to do it. So, most people just memorize clues and learn to associate keywords with answers. And this is part of the having mode because the goal is just to keep this information in your mind. But in an ideal world, everyone would actually learn all of the context and details and truly understand the topic. And this would be the being mode. And it's not only good for the sake of learning, Quiz Bowl is structured to reward like deeper understanding and lateral thinking, so the ability to connect events with each other. So it is advantageous to study in this way, but because of the sheer quantity of information, it's just not practical. So there does need to be a balance between depth and breadth, which you could achieve by the being mode and the having mode, respectively. Um, but so I think it's important to understand that you don't have to choose one mode exclusively over the other. But the problem is most people are only familiar with the having mode, and this can be detrimental in developing complete understanding. However, even if the being mode is better in many scenarios, it's usually limited by practical concerns, meaning the having mode does still have its place. Uh, and the exact balance depends on the activity, so it's important for you to be aware of your choice in order to be effective in any of these key relationships. So, another important concept that we learned about is Joseph Campbell's diagram of the psyche, which we also learned about in US history last year. And it's essential to understanding a lot of the content that Mr. Squires offers because he uses it to explain a lot of concepts that Jung and Campbell, who formulated the diagram, didn't originally include, like the left and right brain. And so far, we've been emphasizing the lower part of the diagram, which is the unconscious, and how it relates to the ego, which is the conscious awareness. Um, and we've talked about how the unconsciousness that's shared by everyone in a society, including forces that threaten the ego, is what gives rise to myths. And that's what makes them relatable, not a conscious left brain understanding. So myths come from kind of a collective unconsciousness. And Mr. Squires uses a lot of anecdotes to illustrate each part of the diagram. But one thing that he brought up is that he's worried that repeating a lot of these stories year after year is dangerous because this reinforces the ego. But I think the main function of the stories is to give us some understanding of a concept and something that we can empathize with, but ultimately it can't replace our experiences for the purposes of understanding our own minds. The next thing we did was we read an article called Knowing Beyond Knowing that was about the process of teaching used in Hermetic traditions. And this directly relates to the idea I mentioned earlier that what's taught to you cannot replace your own experience. So in Hermetic tradition, they rely on esoteric knowledge, which is knowledge that can't be fully taught, and it has to be experienced. Um, and reliance on exoteric knowledge, which is the opposite of that, characterizes the having mode. But seeking an esoteric awareness of yourself and your surroundings, rather than a dogma or truth that's taught to you, characterizes the being mode. And this ties into Fromm's conception of faith. So, in the having mode, people believe they have the answers, and this causes them to be out of touch with reality. And people who are stuck in this mode can find it difficult to make sense of like the changing world around them. And according to Fromm, this is not a necessary part of faith, either in religion or in humanity. Um, in the being mode, people see what they can discover about themselves and about nature just by accepting that they'll gain more through awareness than they will through someone else's teachings. And the idea of esoteric knowledge and experiential learning, I think, is at the core of the MVS immersion method, and it's central to classes like this. Um, but the problem is students tend to be very opposed to situations where they're confused and can't be helped by the teacher. But this process of learning not to rely on the teacher uh, is, at least according to Hermetic tradition, the only way to gain true understanding. So there are a lot of things that make this an unorthodox class that are worth discussing, and one of those is the relaxed atmosphere. That's just an important part of the class, and this includes the music, which you would just never see in most other classes. But it's not really a distraction, and in fact, I think it contributes to the atmosphere, which stimulates honest conversations, uh, because no one's worried that they have to say the right thing, or that if they say the wrong thing, they're going to be judged. And another central part of the class is that there's no strict agenda each day, so we're just free to think about how the concepts we're learning about relate to our own lives. And whether or not we choose to share these thoughts with the class during discussions, um, it's definitely something that we have time to internalize. Um, and I think a defining part of the class is also that it's a welcome break from the stress of other classes. Um, and it's really our only chance during the day and during just our busy lives to consciously think about these things that are ultimately very important to everyone. And especially since my life will be changing so much next year with going to college, I think it's essential for me to be aware of my relationships with myself, my studies, and others. And I think this class will really help me in that regard. Thanks for watching.